Okay. I should just start off by thanking Alex and everybody else for the invitation to speak today. I'm not used to speaking in this kind of environment. My regular job, as Alex said, is I'm actually a secondary school teacher. So I'm used to interruptions. I'm used to people throwing paper airplanes and water bottles at each other during talks, but I'm not so used to perhaps speaking to a group of people who quite possibly know as much or more about my subject matter than I do. My normal agenda for a Wednesday is Harry Potter and William Golding, so this is something a little different. Is my slide showing on the screen for everybody?
Yeah, that's
yes,
fine. Yeah,
okay,
yeah. Thanks, giving some thumbs up.
Okay, so my interest actually in Stephen Wheeler as a character, as a person, and as a man of letters, I think stemmed out of my PhD research, and partly from an article in the Kipling Journal, which I think maybe 5-6 years ago, which I think was written by Mike Kipling, which had some initial information about Wheeler's family background. And given that Wheeler was someone who Kipling perhaps spent more hours with than anyone else during those sort of formative years of his life, between 1882 and 86, I started looking into his background, into his work, particularly his written work, of which there is a lot, and perhaps question some of those preconceptions that I had about Wheeler. So I've started off on the first slide, where you perhaps stereotypically expect to see a picture of the subject. And despite all my research into Wheeler, I have not been able to find a photograph of him anywhere. I'd be very curious and interested to know if anyone else has. But perhaps the quote that I found in the introduction to one of his books summarizes best the reason why not too many photos of him seem to exist. When he wrote that authors should never be seen by authors and little by other people, Wheeler was not a man who appeared to seek the spotlight. He was an archivist, he was a librarian, and as I'd like to talk about a little bit more later, he was very much a literary figure, a man of letters in its own right. Just to briefly run through what I'd like to talk about, just to start off with, we're talking about some of the common perceptions of Stephen Wheeler, and perhaps some of the reasons why I think there's evidence to show some of them may not be accurate. A little bit about Wheeler's Anglo-Indian pedigree, his background, his early life, some of which I'm sure may well be known to many of those present. I'm going to talk a little bit about Wheeler's connection to Afghanistan. He wrote a lot of books and other articles about Afghanistan, about the Great Game. He was acknowledged as an expert on this in later life. And I believe there's evidence in some of these writings to show just how much influence he may have had, or some of his writings may have had, on some poetry and prose that Kipling wrote. I'd like to look a little bit then about Wheeler's political views and some of the things he perhaps shared with Kipling there. And then finally go on to talk about Wheeler's main literary work, which was his expertise in Walter Savage Landor and the extensive work that he did on Landor. With a bibliography, I think, at the end, just as an example to show how much Wheeler actually produced and wrote on an academic level himself. So I think I started off like many, and I don't think I'd yet class myself as a Kipling scholar. Certainly not in the present company. But certainly the impression I got when I started reading about Kipling in more depth was that Wheeler is very much viewed as something of a two-dimensional character, as a bit part, if you like, in Kipling's life, rather than as an actor in his own in his own right. I put up a couple of well-known quotes about him. The one that from Charles Allen, a dry, humorless professional journalist, and I think there's evidence to show Wheeler was very much not humorless. Another well-known quote from an earlier biography, where Charles Carrington described him as a protege of the proprietors, and saying that Wheeler was perhaps piked by that. And again, I think there's very much evidence to show that that is not the was not the case. And then the perhaps somewhat unpleasant comment of Kay Robinson's, when he described, by extension, described Wheeler as a sound second-rate journalist. And also that was what he intended to make of Kipling. And I do think there's a lot of evidence to show that there was a certain dislike, perhaps, between Kay Robinson and Wheeler, but I don't think there's evidence to show that that extended to Kipling. And the overall consensus I gained from my studies was that the feeling seemed to be that Wheeler and Kipling didn't really get on, that Wheeler at worst stymied Kipling's literary development, but at best had no positive influence, gave Kipling no encouragement in his literary development. The first item I came across that I found interesting about Wheeler, and this relates back to the 2017 article in the Kipling Journal. And this was this is actually a copy of a page from the Times of India. I believe it's dated August the 7th, 1875. And it's the announcement in the Times of India that Stephen Wheeler had been appointed to join the Pioneer as assistant editor. And of course, the noteworthy part to that, son of Mr. Talboys Wheeler of the Foreign Office. And that very modest citation of the Foreign Office, of course, held a lot more interest than it seemed to at first sight, because James Talboys Wheeler, of course, was one of the great bureaucrat historians of Anglo-India, someone in the mold of Alfred Lyell or William Hunter, perhaps, and he was a former editor of the Madras Spectator. So not only did he have a very fine Anglo-Indian pedigree and literary pedigree, he also had a journalistic background. At the time of Wheeler's appointment to the Pioneer in 1875, he was secretary to the Chief Commissioner of Burma. He wrote, as many people I'm sure know, many books, including a history of India, a lot of classical works on Herodotus, Thucydides, and various other Indian travelogues. And I can't claim to have read all of those books, but having nosed through quite a few of them, it's interesting how many stories in his work reappear in Stephen Wheeler's works. And then, as I think I'd like to go on to show later, some of these stories then reappear in fictionalized form in some of Kipling's works. Politically, he was, as I think evidence will show Stephen Wheeler was as well, a moderate liberal and reformer. And I think that raised the question to me whether Stephen Wheeler obtained his first post in India very much as Kipling did, through a family connection. And if so, I think that potentially puts the lie to any suggestion that Wheeler would have been piked or upset that Kipling had been a protege of the proprietors, because he certainly had his own Anglo-Indian family connections and pedigree, and if anything, they were better and higher than Kipling. So Stephen Wheeler's own background: he was born in Chesterton, Cambridgeshire, in 1854. His paternal grandfather was James Luff Wheeler. He was also related to David Alphonso Talboys. These were the two men who founded the Oxford English Classics series. So his family background was very strong in journalism, in the literary field. So I feel the description of him as a a humorless professional journalist who'd be sort of picked up and recruited in England perhaps initially seems a little unfair. And the more I looked into his background, the more I was struck by how much he had in common with Kipling. Like Kipling, he was educated in England while his parents were in India. The census report from 1861 tells us that he was actually living with an aunt at that time. He was educated at Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Cranbrook, which is now Cranbrook School in Kent. And looking through, there's a number of reports on him from the school and from newspapers at the time, which show that he excelled in classics, in sports, in drama. And one of the most interesting things I thought about him from his early days at school was that he was a classicist. He not only produced and directed his own performance of Aristophanes' Acharnians, he translated the play himself. He played the lead role of Dicaeopolis. And given the rather bawdy nature of that Aristophanes comedy, again, that was one of the first things that suggested to me that perhaps he wasn't quite as humorless as supposed. This particular performance got rave reviews in the local press in Kent at the time, and I'm interested in contacting the school to find out whether any copies of his translation of Aristophanes survive. So the next thing I dug out, which again suggested that Wheeler was fairly well connected, and this is the passenger manifest from the Overland Mail in 1875 of Wheeler's passage to India, when he moved there to take his role in the Pioneer. And down near the bottom of the slide, of course, where it says Venice to Bombay, we can see that Mr. S. Wheeler actually travelled in the company of Mr. and Mrs. Percy Sinnett. And Alex will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Percy Sinnett was the editor of the Pioneer at the time, as well as the famous theosophist. And the fact that Wheeler travelled in their company, again, suggested to me again that perhaps he was more than just a young journalist who'd been recruited for a role, that he was a well-connected figure. He had family connections at the Pioneer, and he travelled in the company of the editor and his wife when he came out to India. And like Kipling, he did his own 7 years hard. He started off at the Pioneer in 1875 as a young assistant editor. He was a little older than Kipling when he moved out to India, but again, there are significant parallels, I think, here. He remained at the Pioneer until May 1882, when he was appointed to the CMG. By the time he moved to Lahore, he was married. He had 3 young daughters, the last of whom was born while he was in England on leave in March of 1882. He took 6 months leave over 1881-82, during which time he, as people know, interviewed and accepted Kipling for the post at the CMG. Interestingly, that it seems that wasn't the first time he'd met Kipling. He'd actually met Kipling, as I think Mike Kipling's article mentioned, and as was mentioned in the Kipling Journal back in 1930, he actually met Kipling in 1871 when Kipling was just 5 years old, when their families visited each other. So the Anglo-Indian pedigree and the connection between their families dates back quite a while, and again suggests that there's no hint of any kind of animosity there. On the contrary, their families clearly knew each other and had established relationships. This is a copy of the the first page report from the Civil and Military Gazette from May the 18th, 1882, announcing Stephen Wheeler's appointment as editor. Going back through Indian newspaper files from that period, 1875 to 1882, it's interesting to see how often Stephen Wheeler is referred to favourably as a well-known professional journalist with an excellent professional reputation. And I think the comments here, long and favourably known to Indian journalism as connected to the pioneer. So he'd established himself as a professional, thorough journalist, and he'd earned his appointment as editor. Interestingly, he'd returned to India just 2 days before this appointment. So he clearly didn't have too much time to find his feet after landing back in Bombay and then making his way to Lahore. One of the things that interested me was Wheeler's editorial style, because there seemed to have been a lot of suggestions that he was rather dry in his editorial style, that he wasn't keen on literary work, he wasn't keen on poetry, for example, that he certainly didn't encourage Kipling to write poetry or allow him to publish poetry in the pages of the Civil and Military Gazette. And I spent some time doing some comparative research, just looking at through the pages of the Civil and Military Gazette in the years immediately before Wheeler took over as editor, and then looking through them in the particularly in the year immediately after he took over. And what I found interestingly is that there's considerably more verse and literary work which appears in the Civil and Military Gazette in the year after Wheeler took over as editor than there was in the preceding years. One particular example in the summer of 1882, which was immediately after Wheeler had taken over as editor, before Kipling was arrived. I'm getting an echo there, Alex.
That's okay, Michael.
A series of poems were published in the pages of the CMG entitled Songs of the People over the summer of 1882. And this was just one example. I believe this is from August 1882. And there was a whole series of these poems published during the first few months of Wheeler's editorship of the CMG, which were native Indian poems published in the original language with translation in English. Most by an anonymous RCT, whoever that was, doesn't ring any bells.
RCT.
I'd be interested if RCT rings any bells to anybody. And these poems covered a variety of topics. This is a fairly typical one. But what this, I think, showed to me was that there's no evidence, in fact, quite the contrary. There's evidence to show that Wheeler had nothing against verse, literary content, lighter literary content appearing in the pages of his paper. There's significantly more of this amount of this style of content appearing in the CMG in the months after he took over as editor than under the preceding editor, who I'll admit I'm not sure who that was. What I'd like to then move on to look at and to talk about is one of the areas that was the Stephen Wheeler's key field of expertise, and something he wrote a lot about, including at least one full-length book, which was Afghanistan, the Great Game, the political intrigues between Britain and Russia in Afghanistan. And this is something that Wheeler wrote a number of articles and books about, and was clearly something that he regarded as a key field of importance. Just as an example, He wrote an article, The Afghan Boundary, in Macmillan's magazine, 1888. He wrote a very interesting article in the Pall Mall magazine a few years later entitled The Cloud in the Pamirs, which contains all kinds of fascinating details about rival topographical surveys, British and Russian, trying to outwit each other in remote mountain passes in the Wakhan corridor. And he wrote a full-length book, biography of the Amir Abdur Rahman, which was published in 1895, and which is, I think, one of the most interesting of his works, and one of the ones that perhaps gives some significant insights into the way that he and Kipling may have exchanged stories, and perhaps how Kipling may have gained and modelled some of his prose and poetry on works which originated from Wheeler. This is the front piece of the book in question. Interesting to note that Stephen Wheeler's FRGS is not only a member of the Royal Geographical Society, but also sometime fellow of the Punjab University, according to the title of the book. And this book, I think, is fascinating, and it's one I've actually got a copy of it here. Sadly, not an original first edition, but a facsimile. And it's a fascinating book in that it's full of very, very interesting excerpts, stories, fables regarding people, events, life in Afghanistan in the 1870s, 1880s, some of which, one in particular that I'm going to put up on a following slide as an example, some of which were then versified or fictionalized by Kipling. There's fables in the book with quirky moral messages. There's all kinds of collected stories, personal anecdotes, some of which appear to originate from some of his father's work, but many of them clearly he collected himself. What I found interesting is that Wheeler clearly had one thing in common with Kipling, in that, like Kipling, he was a collector of stories. Unlike Kipling, he did not fictionalize or sensationalize or reinvent these stories. He merely chronicled and archived them. But this particular book includes interesting tales from the Emir's doctor, his dentist, English ladies in Kabul, and some of it is bleakly humorous. I think it's one of those books that if you pick it up and read a couple of chapters, it immediately dispels any notion that Wheeler was humorless. There are many very funny excerpts from this book. One of which I'd like to put up, and it's just a section, a page from the book, which may ring some bells. This is a chapter where he was dealing with how the Amir dispensed justice in Afghanistan, and he wrote, "A grim sort of humour not infrequently inspired the Amir's judgments. Once a man was brought before him who declared in a state of unrepressed excitement that the Russians were advancing to invade Afghanistan. 'The Russians are coming,' said the Emir. 'Then you shall be taken to the summit of yonder tower and shall have no food till you see them arrive.' He evidently got this story from Darmstadt, who did not say whether this heroic cure for a fit of Russophobia proved effectual, but, and this is the most interesting line to me, later writers have invented a sequel." And as I'm sure it does to many, this immediately brought to mind to me Kipling's poem, the Ballad of the King's Jest, where there's too many similarities in that story for it to be coincidence. Now, the tower has become, I believe it's Peachtree in Kipling's poem, and the bayonets underneath are obviously a dramatized, fictionalized edition, but it's clearly the same story. And that begged the question to me, where did the story come from? Did Kipling originally get that story from Wheeler? Now, given that this book was not published until 1895, it's of course perfectly possible that Wheeler got the story from Kipling, or that they both got the story from Darmstadt. But what it does, I think, clearly evidence is that Wheeler and Kipling shared stories. That Wheeler had no interest in sensationalizing stories, in fictionalizing them. It's interesting to me that Kipling chose to change the inanimate tower into a living tree, which perhaps symbolizes how Kipling changed these stories, fictionalized them to give them life, whereas Wheeler simply chronicled the stories that he picked up. And there's a number of examples of this in this book, of stories which clearly link to either short stories or verses of Kipling's, which were then embellished in fictionalized form, but which appear to have their origins in factual stories chronicled by Wheeler. Wheeler was very much a chronicler. He was an archivist. He was the chief librarian to the Oriental Club in London for many years. There's no evidence, despite his extensive bibliography, of him ever having any interest in writing fiction. He's very much a historian, a chronicler. Many of his tales do appear to originate from his father, which also led me to wonder whether potentially some of Kipling's stories came from Wheeler via his father, who wrote a number of very interesting travelogues full of old tales, particularly those from the frontier states. But as I think I just said, at a minimum, I think this provides evidence that Kipling and Wheeler shared stories. It also provides an interesting opportunity to compare a factual account with a fictionalized version of Kipling's, to see how he used an actual factual story and embellished it in verse form. And I think it contrasts interestingly with Kay Robinson's famous comment about how those who knew the real Jack Barrett, good fellow as he was, which, as far as I'm aware, he never provided any further information on. Kay Robinson suggested he knew the stories behind Kipling's verses, but never actually gave any evidence as to whether this was actually true or not. Whereas Wheeler actually provides factual accounts which clearly link to Kipling's verses and stories. The other, I think, obvious potential influence is on Kim, particularly because of Wheeler's extensive writings on the Afghan border issues. Obsession is perhaps too strong a word, but Wheeler was clearly convinced that the Russians posed an imminent threat to India, that an invasion was probable, was inevitable at some point. His works that he wrote, both The Afghan Boundary and The Cloud at the Pamirs, both detail this power play in extremely meticulous detail. They include very interesting maps that Wheeler drew as well, one of which I believe I have on the next slide. And as I say, especially at The Cloud and the Pamirs, which has around 3.5 pages detailing how these topographical British and Russian survey teams, if you like, battled each other in remote mountain passes, trying to log different territory at the same time. And this clearly evoked the background for Kim. There's a quote from Wheeler's Afghan Boundary, where he wrote, "The Russians are steadily, nonetheless surely consolidating their hold on the country. In this way, they're preparing for an attack on India." And Wheeler was obviously convinced this was the case. And this, to me, also potentially put in another light the fact that Wheeler gave Kipling so much work when he first arrived in India, retranslating Russian newspapers. Perhaps this was less, it certainly wasn't work that Wheeler had no interest in, that he was passing off to Kipling because he didn't want to do it. On the contrary, it was a topic that Wheeler, from his later writings, clearly considered of paramount importance. And the fact that he shared that topic and work on that topic with Kipling from the beginning, led me to wonder how much else they actually shared and discussed, and how much potentially Wheeler's thoughts and Wheeler's opinions about the Russian threat and the Afghan issue potentially influenced Kipling and his later work. This is one of Wheeler's maps from his article in the Pall Mall magazine, 1893, where he details the changing boundaries between 1872 and 1890. And there's a number of these maps. There's around half a dozen of these maps that he edits and draws in his different articles. The next thing I went on to try to look at was to get some idea of Wheeler's political views and see if potentially there was any evidence there of maybe discord between him and Kipling. The article he wrote for Macmillan's magazine in 1889 was entitled "Home Rule for India," and contrary to the suggestion of the title, he wasn't advocating home rule for India. But the article is interesting in that it gives very clear insights into Wheeler's attitude to India, to Indians, and the extent to which his views may or may not have mirrored or tallied with Kipling's. And just to summarize his views as laid out in this fairly lengthy article, with a couple of quotes from the article, he displays throughout this article and others that he wrote very much a sensitivity and understanding for Indians. He writes about how he has a liking for Indians, hospitable, likes a joke. He writes a lot about the lack of opportunities for Indians at the time who sought to join the civil service, and the fact that in theory an Indian could join the civil service, but actually had to travel to London to take part in the examinations, which clearly put him at something of a disadvantage. And some of the other comments that Wheeler made in this article brought to mind some of Kipling's early verse to me. I mean, he was absolutely willing to acknowledge complaints against British officialdom. He acknowledges that the British government has a tendency towards hypocrisy, that it doesn't always treat Indians well, no respecter of persons. And some of the comments he made in this article brought to mind, I believe it's the Mask of Plenty in Departmental Ditties, where Kipling wrote quite sort of savagely about the hypocrisy of the British government in their attitudes to the Indian peasantry. Another comment that he made brought to mind another verse of Kipling's, where he wrote, "The masses of India are profoundly indifferent to everything that does not immediately concern the cultivation of the soil." And that immediately brought to mind to me, I believe it's What the People Said, where the Indian peasant watching the Jubilee celebrations, who says, "God raiseth them up and driveth them forth as the dust of the ploughshare flies in the breeze." And that would appear to to tally very much again with Wheeler's views as expressed here. And finally, as I guess was common at the time, Wheeler absolutely had a conviction that the imperial system was in the best interest of Indians. That he believed that without the British imperial system being in place, India would descend into chaos, and they had and that rival factions, religions would descend into murdering each other, which again I believe is what happened. The other poem in Departmental Ditties, Hari Chanda Mukherjee, Pride of Bow Bazaar, which again lays out that same belief and approach. So what struck me here is that there's clearly no evidence of political difference or of strongly different political opinions between what Wheeler believed and what Kipling certainly at the time believed, which again to me begs the question as to whether they had coincidentally developed the same views through their family backgrounds, or how much they'd shared, how much Wheeler had potentially influenced Kipling's views here. What's also notable that particular article, which I don't think struck me as in any way extremist, was described in a review in the CMG as extremist. There's a quite scathing, savage editorial on Wheeler's article, Home Rule for India, where the CMG, which I believe was still being edited by K. Robinson at the time, mocked his literary style, named him, mocked his literary style as disappointing, as inadequate, and denounced his views as extremist. And I think that perhaps offered further evidence of some sort of friction potentially between K. Robinson and Stephen Wheeler. But it didn't seem to me to provide any evidence of such friction between Kipling and Wheeler. Certainly, I think in Kipling's earliest writings, there's evidence of a certain amount of frustration, which perhaps is natural, a 16, 17-year-old boy having to do some of the less interesting or glamorous work of journalism. Most of us have been there at some points of our lives and resented that. But there's clearly no lasting animosity between them. And Kipling acknowledged that most expressly in Something of Myself, and in his previous letters to Wheeler, both of which I think are perhaps more notable than they seem to be at first sight. And particularly his first letter of 1888. And I'd just like to put up on the next slide. This is a review of Departmental Ditties. It's from the St. James's Gazette, August, I believe, of 1888, and it was written by Stephen Wheeler. It's, as far as I'm aware, it's Wheeler's only public commentary on Kipling's work that was published, and it's interesting reading through this how, first of all, very obviously the writer is someone who shares with Kipling the knowledge of what these verses actually mean. The paragraph at the top where Wheeler is commenting on La Nuit Blanche, where he says how real only those who have had the privilege of viewing the original wild pictures can fully know. And then he talks about how accurate the coolness and the soft light that precede daybreak. This is clearly a review written by someone who is familiar with this firsthand. The review itself is also very positive and very generous. And just at the bottom, underneath the quote from In Springtime, he writes, "Here we are at the root of the matter. The author of Departmental Ditties is a homesick poet. He has seen Anglo-India and Anglo-Indian society under the influence of homesickness," which suggests, of course, that this is something that Wheeler had witnessed firsthand in Kipling. And Kipling's response to that was something I thought was very interesting, and perhaps is testament to something else that Kipling and Wheeler shared, and that was a desire to keep certain elements of themselves private. Because when Kipling wrote back to Wheeler about this review, he thanked him. He sent copies of Soldiers 3 and the Gadsbys and asked him if he could make sure the Gazette reviewed them. But he added, "Don't review them yourself, you know too much." And I got the sense from that he perhaps didn't appreciate the fact that Wheeler was, if you like, getting inside his head, that he was commenting on what Kipling was thinking here. And this desire to keep oneself private is clearly something that Wheeler and Kipling appear to have shared. I should note that review of Departmental Ditties in the St. James's Gazette was anonymous. Wheeler did not put his name to it. Thomas Pinney noted that throughout Wheeler's life, he no doubt had many invitations to comment publicly on Kipling, but never appears to have done so. There's the one letter that he wrote to the Kipling Journal in 1930, which was very short and certainly didn't contain anything in the nature of personal information. And there's this one anonymous review. But given that so many other people who Kipling knew, many of whom Kipling clearly spent a lot less time with and knew Kipling a lot less well than Wheeler did, fell out with Kipling in later life through talking about him publicly. And the extremely positive comments that Kipling made about Wheeler in his autobiography suggests to me that certainly that he appreciated the fact that Wheeler never discussed their relationship in public, never discussed his work with Kipling in public. And there's another quote from one of Wheeler's works here, which I think provides further evidence of this shared outlook. And this is an extract from Wheeler's introduction to his Letters of Walter Savage Landor, where he comments on his attitude to authors and authorship. And he writes, "In one's first judgment of a book, doubtless it is better to avoid too intimate a knowledge of the man who wrote it. The personal bias works unfairly, sometimes in the direction of undue adulation, sometimes of unreasoning dislike." And that was perhaps, to me, sums up one of the reasons why he chose never to comment on Kipling. And I owe Alex thanks for providing me with this quote from one of Kipling's letters, which appears to mirror the same approach, where Kipling responded to a request to, I believe it was to judge a short story competition, by saying, "I've made it my rule never under any circumstances to aid in judgment on the work of my contemporaries." So this unwillingness to comment on other writers, this unwillingness to publicly give opinions about other writers, was clearly something that Wheeler and Kipling shared in their approach. And the more one sort of looks into Wheeler's writings and Wheeler's attitude, the more I think it started to strike me how much they did share in their approach to so many different things. Too much perhaps for it to be purely coincidence. I think that there's certainly a case can be made that a lot of Wheeler's attitudes potentially rubbed off on Kipling, as is perhaps natural for someone who was his first employer and who worked with him so closely for so many years during that period of his life. And it contrasts sharply, I think, with as I mentioned before, with Kay Robinson's attitude to to speaking out about Kipling, which I believe didn't go down too well with Kipling in later years. The other letter that we have that Kipling wrote to Wheeler is a response to Wheeler's letter asking for a reference. And that to me is also interesting because it clearly shows that even in the 1890s, there were people telling Wheeler that Kipling bore a grudge against him. And Kipling's very, very emphatic in his reply when he makes clear that this is not the case. And to quote from the letter, Wheeler had evidently spoken to Sidney Colvin, and Sidney Colvin had suggested to him that an approach to Kipling would be unwelcome. Sidney Colvin, incidentally, also wrote a biography of Landor, which is another link between him and Wheeler. But Kipling says much the same here as he did in his autobiography towards the end of his life, where he says, you know, it did me a heap of good. And then he goes on to say something else, which I also thought was interesting. He talks about the awful siege when you put the old CNM books in order, which has perhaps a bit of a hint of nostalgia about it to me, but also goes to this idea of that Wheeler was very much, say, an archivist, a librarian, an organizer. But then he talks about Wheeler having a cast steel memory and a store of Oriental knowledge that most Orientalists haven't got. And I think the book I mentioned earlier, the Amir Abdurrahman, again, is very much evidential of this store of Oriental knowledge, the amount of anecdotes and stories that come up in that book. And the cast steel memory, the fact that Wheeler clearly remembered all of these stories, related them. How many of Kipling's sources originated in Wheeler? What I thought might be interesting to, sorry, this leads, let's get back. This letter, this same letter leads into Wheeler's other lifelong passion, which was Walter Savage Landor, because Kipling went on in that letter to offer to purchase for tricks, apparently, an item Wheeler had obviously told him he'd obtained, which was a lock of hair belonging to Rose Aylmer, who was the young socialite who died at the age of 20, I believe, in India, and was the subject of Landor's most famous love poem. And at some point shortly after Wheeler returned to England in 1887, he somehow managed to obtain Landor's lost writing desk, containing Landor's original papers, his letters, a lot of unpublished work of Landor's, and these locks of Rose Aylmer's hair. And quite where and how he obtained this, I haven't as yet been able to establish. Be very interested if anyone else has any ideas on or knows anything about that. But what is clear is that Wheeler was able to use those materials to establish himself as the world's leading authority on Walter Savage Landor. He edited and published a whole series of books, again, some of which I have here. Landor's unpublished verse, his letters, Landor's biography of Charles Fox, his bibliography, and finally, in the last years of Wheeler's life, the 16 volumes of Landor's complete works. There's some examples here of Wheeler's original notes on Landor's work, and even just looking at these, it's clear, just not just that how neat his handwriting is, but the thoroughness, the meticulous nature of the notes that he makes, with the footnotes, for example, to the Vale Vale Dixit, and he references it to its source, Vale Vale Inquit from Virgil, He references the other Latin quotes, and going through these pages of notes that he made on Landor's work, every I is dotted, every T is crossed, every single footnote is explained, everything is neatly organized. He's the archetypal archivist and librarian. And again, I think that bears testament to what Kipling said about how ultra rigidly organized you are, as alas I am not. And testifies to the fact that Kipling wasn't just being polite here. This was clearly an accurate reflection of who and what Wheeler was. Wheeler was secretary, as I'm sure many people know, of the Oriental Club in London from the 1890s onwards. Going through back copies of the Times, what is interesting is how often Wheeler wrote to the Times, how often he wrote columns for the Times and for other publications such as the St. James's Gazette, and that he was recognized in these pages by eminent journalists and writers in London at the time as being an authority not only on Landor, but on Anglo-India and particularly on Afghanistan. There's numerous cases of articles he wrote into the Times on Anglo-India. He responded and corrected letters that other historians or journalists wrote about Anglo-India or about Afghanistan, if he considered there was material in there that that he didn't agree with. And he was also a friend and regular correspondent of Swinburne. They exchanged multiple letters in the last 10, 12 years of Swinburne's life, and Wheeler actually wrote Swinburne's obituary in the Times after he died in 1909. So he was very much a man of letters in the last, 30 years of his life, from the turn of the century onwards. He moved and communicated in the highest literary circles in London. What's interesting, if one looks through some of the letters that were exchanged between Wheeler and Swinburne, is how much they shared in common in their interests, but also how many of those interests were also very much Kipling's as well. They have multiple letters where they discuss Edward Fitzgerald and their shared love of his translation of the Rubaiyat. There's also a number of references to that in Wheeler's biography of the Amir Abdurrahman, where he frequently slips in quotes and references to the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which again is was a favorite of Kipling's. So there's further evidence there, I think, of shared interests. The fact that Wheeler was a friend and correspondent of Swinburne, and given Kipling's own love of Swinburne, I think suggests again more in common there than perhaps might be attributable to coincidence. So just to summarize, I believe Kipling, in one of his very early verses in India, referred to Wheeler as his eternal pal. And I initially took that as being perhaps a sarcastic comment on how Wheeler very much wasn't his pal. But on reflection, perhaps that to me, the word eternal perhaps is stressing how much time he must actually have spent in Wheeler's company during those years. How much, given the interest they shared and given how much Wheeler clearly knew, given this cast steel memory that Wheeler had and his store of Oriental knowledge, how much of Wheeler's knowledge was passed on to Kipling, and what influence did he potentially have on Kipling? How many of Kipling's ideas potentially originated in discussions with Wheeler? I mean, the example of the Amir and the man seeing the Russians in the tower. is a clear link to the Ballad of the King's Jest. But there are a number of others in just the small amount of Wheeler's work that I've so far been able to read in detail. I'm sure there are other works of Wheeler's that I've yet to dig out. As has come up, and I think in a couple of past articles in the Kipling Journal, that there was evidence of long-standing relationship and even friendship between their families. There's also a record in 1893 of Stephen Wheeler and Lockwood Kipling jointly presenting a paper on Afghanistan, on the classical influence in the architecture of the Indus region in Afghanistan, which was a paper they jointly presented in London in 1893. Which again suggests an ongoing connection and relationship between their families as well as shared interests. A bibliography, just to give an idea of the extent of Wheeler's knowledge and the amount that he wrote. This is by no means complete, because there are many other potential. This is just what I've been able to dig out so far. I'm just bringing these up. There are various magazine articles covering the Indian native press, covering Afghanistan, covering Mendes Pinto, the Portuguese Indian explorer of the 16th century, who Wheeler wrote an article for the Royal Geographical Journal. There's his biography of the Amir Abdurrahman. There's his extensive Landor writings. There's an article I have not yet been able to read entitled Sikhs and Boers, a Parallel. There's his history of the Delhi Coronation Durbar. There's his biography of Charles James Fox. And there is his additional work, bibliography and complete works of Landor. So I mean, that's and there are references in the contemporary press to a number of other works, including a history of Afghanistan, written by Wheeler, which I haven't yet been able to locate or establish definitively whether it was in fact published. But there was a report in the Times in 1898 of Stephen Wheeler's Secretary of the Oriental Club and his forthcoming history of Afghanistan, to be published by and giving the publisher, but no record that I've as yet been able to find of it actually being published. So this bibliography may not yet be complete, but it gives, I think, an idea of the extent of Wheeler's literary output. I say literary, of course, because there's nothing fictional here. This is all historical, political, and literary. And the last points to make. There's a note in the Times mentioning that on Wheeler's death, his daughter was awarded a pension in recognition of the services rendered by her father to literature. And there's a number of issues that are still of interest to me that I'm looking into. And again, I'd be most interested if anyone else has any insights on these. Wheeler graduated from school in 1872 and he moved to India in 1875. In that intervening period, was he working in journalism, as Charles Allen suggests, or did he potentially go to study at university? That's something I have not yet been able to find out. How he obtained Landor's lost desk and papers, what other writings or correspondence he may have had. And I would have loved to have been able to finish up with a picture of Wheeler, but as mentioned, I have not been able to locate one. So perhaps the best way would be just to finish up with some images of some of the books that he wrote, which he clearly preferred to be viewed than himself. I've got a few of those books here, which I brought with me, but a little bit difficult to show on the screen. I'd be more than happy to hear anybody's comments, feedback, questions, criticism, corrections, or anything else.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Rufus. You've really taken a a character who's rendered in 2 dimensions in most of the classic biographies of Kipling and restored him to his proper humane dimensions. The curious thing is that you've highlighted lots of those qualities that we did associate him, such as being punctilious, being even a pedant, were true, but they weren't matters of dislike for Kipling. They were matters of admiration for him, potentially. He looked up to him and had cordial relations with him, unlike with Kay Robinson later. I can hold this up to the screen now. You can see this handsome volume of the Letters of Walter Savage Landor more clearly.
I picked that for £2 in a second-hand shop.
Huh. As an old owner's stamp and a bookplate, Edward H. Doughty. I have several of my own questions, but I'll open to the floor first. Some of you might have some burning queries about Stephen Wheeler. Yes, I can see hands going up already. John Radcliffe, would you like to go first? Oh, John, can you unmute, please? Can you unmute, please, John? I can't hear you.
Sorry, forgive me. Am I?
Yes.
Yes. Great.
You're mute again, John.
Back on again.
No, can't hear.
Oh, John, please, can you click the button again? Yeah, the mute's gone back on.
No, can't hear.
No, John, we still can't hear you. Could I go over to Fred? I'll go to Fred in the meantime, and in the meantime, John, you can see what's wrong with your computer. Yeah, Fred, please ask your question.
Well, this was fascinating. I didn't know very much of anything about Stephen Wheeler. My question is there such a thing as a biography of him around, aside from the one that, of course, you're going to be writing, I hope?
I haven't been able to find anything yet. He doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. His Wikipedia page links to a cricketer with the same name. As far as I'm aware, that unless anyone knows anything I don't, which is quite possible, I haven't been able to dig up any kind of biography or summary of his life. I think very much as Alex said, he's sort of been regarded as an unimportant figure, as a sort of 2-dimensional bit player in Kipling's life, who wasn't really worthy of his own study. So no, as far as I'm aware, there is no biography or study of Wheeler as a character written, apart from, as I say, there was I believe Mike Kipling wrote an article in the Kipling Journal in 2017, which dealt a little bit with Wheeler's family background.
Are you going to write one for us?
Yeah, start by changing that. Have the Wikipedia article up. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I might correct his Wikipedia page.
Oh, John, I think we can hear you now.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to say 2 things, really. First of all, I've been absolutely fascinated by Rufus's account, which has been extraordinarily interesting. But beyond that, I wonder if you'd agree that the impressions that we have of Stephen Wheeler are essentially to do with what conclusions the biographers have drawn from the historical evidence and what Kipling wrote, rather than what Kipling wrote himself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think for a long time, I think my own opinion of Wheeler was very much, coloured by, I think, starting out anyway. But one reads a biography written by someone who is eminently more qualified and learned than oneself, and one presumes that their impression of the character is likely to be correct. But the more I sort of looked into it, as you said, that I have not been able to find anything Kipling ever wrote or said, apart from the letters of a 16, 17-year-old boy who is sort of naturally chafing at his boss telling him what to do, which is not an uncommon human characteristic to be in, and something which most of us have probably done at some point in our lives. So yes, I'd absolutely agree that I think the impression of Wheeler that's common is perhaps more perpetuated by biographers, particularly earlier biographers, than anything Kipling himself said.
I'm relieved to hear you say that. but I do hope you're going to write this up more fully and extensively, because it's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry,
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that Richard Maidman, so your hand also raced up at the start. And did you have a question, Richard?
Actually, it was an observation rather than a question, because after Wheeler died, an unnamed journalist at the Civil and Military Gazette was given to write his memories of Kipling, and he looked for a photo, and he couldn't find, well, he did in the end. He says, in the manager's room at the old offices on the Mall, I remember among the few yellow group photographs, one showing his clean-shaven face of Wheeler, shrinkingly seated amongst bearded giants. So,
but the photo itself was not.
No, unfortunately. So there was a photo of Wheeler shrinkingly seated amongst bearded giants, but what happened to it, I don't know.
That's interesting, because he clearly was never a man who sought the limelight in that way. But it's interesting to know that a photo of him does exist, that there is something there to look for.
So it could be a group photo that comes to light in the end instead of individual portraits.
Well, and then at least one knows who Wheeler is. Then he's the
Actually, I do have a question. One thing that amazed me is why Wheeler was so obsessed with Walter Savage Landor. If Wheeler was a precise archivist, Landor seems a complete contrast. And he's one of these writers who wrote masses and was greatly admired in his own day. And there are one or two little quotes you see that are remembered today. Was it a sort of an attraction of opposites?
Yeah, I think this was something that interested me as well, and it was something that, and again, that perhaps suggested there was a bit more depth to Wheeler than initially thought. There seems to have been a particular interest in Landor amongst Anglo-Indian scholars of the time. I mean, Sidney Colvin, the first cousin of Sir Auckland, of the Rupert of Omar Calvin fame, wrote a biography of Landor that was published, I think, about 10 years before Kipling moved out to India. So exactly where Wheeler's interest in Landor came from, that I don't know, and I agree that it doesn't seem like the most natural fit, particularly the work that Wheeler did editing and writing Landor's half-completed biography of Charles Fox, who was very much a sort of an anti-establishment revolutionary, and not the kind of character one would associate with certainly what Wheeler has been stereotypically looked at to be. So that suggested that perhaps there was more to the romantic of in Wheeler than has been thought. I mean, I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive, being a sort of a meticulous archivist and having that sort of romantic literary side to his nature. But I agree, it doesn't seem like the most natural fit, and I found it curious as well. Whether it was that somehow by some sort of lucky happenstance he came across this missing writing desk, and it presented him with a literary opportunity. But I'd suspect it was something a little bit more deeper and long-standing than that.
There's a more long-standing affinity as well, combined with the opportunity.
Yeah.
There's something about Landor that appeals to Anglo-Indians, but I can't put my finger on it. Perhaps you
Right.
might have some suggestions. And
Alex, may I ask a question?
yeah.
Now, it's a wonderful paper, and I do hope to see at least some of it in the Kipling Journal. I was flagging a bit because I'm not feeling very well, but it was, it was fantastic. I want to say two things. One is that it was almost all new to me, except Richard Maidment didn't mention this, that he has actually edited Wheeler's review of departmental ditties, and it's going to appear in the next Kipling Journal. So I think that's worth saying. I might have said it. The other thing is that as the editor of the Kipling Journal, I'm an academic, and I'm a bit like Wheeler, I suppose, in that way. I scrupulously cross all T's and dot all I's. And I find that Kipling is constantly quoting some bits of Englet from memory, and always invariably inaccurate. And I have sort of thought again and again that if I had been his editor, he would have driven me up the wall, because he was always doing it. It was obviously from memory, and he never bothered to check. And we know he didn't have Google, but he did have books. He just never bothered to look anything up. And those early stories, again and again, he quotes, I don't know, G. Winkler or whatever. And there's always, when you quote from memory, I know this because I do it a lot myself. You always scramble a word or two, and it never seems to have occurred to have Kipling to correct it. So I have always had a lot of sympathy with Wheeler's so-called pedantry. I think I would have got thoroughly pissed off too. But that is all.
I can't imagine Wheeler's job was the easiest in the world during those during those years. But the fact that he managed to keep any complaints he had private, not only at the time but for the rest of his life. Very
much to his credit.
Yeah.
And Richard has edited the correspondence between them, and Kipling's letter to Wheeler is thoroughly friendly. As people will be able to read in March. That's when it's coming out. So I want to thank you very, very much for that. It's really a fantastic paper. And
thank you. I look forward to seeing that in March.
Au revoir.
Oh, Mike, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes.
You'll see I'm joining on my phone now as well, so I can have a backup because we're running low on battery on the computer.
Okay. Now I'd just like to say I'm very pleased that the little bit of research I wrote a few years ago in the Kipling Journal has sparked so much work. It was really fantastic to learn so much more about Stephen Wheeler's life when I really only knew a little bit about the beginning. Just perhaps to add that his connections to the Kiplings were very much through Alice rather than, I think, through Lockwood. It was Alice's days as a young unmarried lady in Oxford where she came across the Wheeler and Talboys families, and I guess that was perpetuated when she married Lockwood and they went out to India.
Yeah. So and I think it was I think it was in 2017 your article, and I think and reading that, I mean that was I think perhaps the sort of the starting point, the fact that the connection with James Talboys Wheeler that as you say sort of sparked that sort of first sort of question as to whether maybe there was a bit more to Wheeler than is commonly considered. So thank you for that article and for that as well.
Thank you for carrying it forward.
Do we have any further questions at this point?
Yeah,
I think John wanted to come back in, didn't you? Yeah.
Hello.
Yes,
sorry, can I come up with one?
Please do. Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's simply that I wanted to ask Rufus though. I'm sure that Kipling's account of Wheeler's systematic management of a daily newspaper, which was an appallingly difficult and demanding task. Where had he got that from, Wheeler? Where had he got those skills and that understanding from?
Yeah, and I think that's, well, that's an interesting question, and that's one of the reasons why I'd like to fill in that gap in Wheeler's CV. Like, what did he do between 1872 and 1875? Now, he clearly, you know, he'd spent 7 years on the Pioneer, and according to sort of all reports in the Anglo-Indian press, very creditably. So I'm presuming a lot of those skills, some of those skills may have been natural, may have been inherent, but clearly a lot of it had been learned and had been learnt on the job, which does suggest to me that there's an element to which he was employed on merit rather than because his father was well connected. But whether he had previously worked in journalism and gained experience in journalism in England, which is perfectly possible considering his family background in journalism and the fact that his brother is known to have worked in journalism in the UK as well. So whether he left school, went into journalism in the UK, as Charles Allen seems to suggest in his biography, that he was a journalist in England, but clearly he had those natural sort of organizational skills. Yeah. And as someone who is not naturally very organized myself, it's one of those things that it's you know, some people are naturally organized and some people aren't. And even looking through Wheeler's notes, it was immediately sort of obvious how systematic, how meticulous. Yeah. And I think that somehow this has been turned by a lot of biographers, as you said earlier, into pedantry, into something negative. Whereas not only is there, I don't think, any evidence that there's no evidence, I don't think that Kipling viewed it that way, other than as a teenage boy, you know, that sort of natural frustration of not being able to do what he wanted when he wanted to do it, and having to learn how to do the job properly rather than being able to sit around and write poetry instead, which is something he clearly recognized later in life. You know, when he said, what little I ever learned of organisation and of a job I learned from Stephen Wheeler.
Where did you find those notes that you showed, Rufus? The notes of this carefully written footnoting citations of Wheeler's. Are those in an archive?
No, I found them. Somebody was offering them for sale on a secondhand book website, and I actually picked them up and bought them.
Fantastic! Brilliant find.
It's someone just had an annotated copy of Landor's poem, but by a Stephen Wheeler, with a signature at the bottom, S Wheeler. And I picked them up and bought them. I had and they're very clearly, unless they're two Stephen Wheelers who both annotate Walter Savage Landor's work. No, it's so yeah. No, I happen to actually one of my hobbies, as I think Alex knows, is collecting old books and manuscripts. So picking up those old examples of Wheeler's work was something that, and it's interesting just looking through them. You know, when you've actually got them in your hands and to look through them, it's hard to get it across on the screen. You know, the level of organisation and the way that the notes are made and the footnotes cross match across each page, and every Latin reference is translated at the bottom with a reference to not only to which classical author it comes from, but which page and which volume it's and which publisher. And this was something that Wheeler just appeared to have done naturally with everything he did, because these were his private notes. You know, these weren't something that he but I guess when you're someone who's organized in that way, that's just what you do naturally. And as someone who is absolutely not organized naturally, it's something I can very much respect. But and it was so I think to sum up, to answer your question, I think from everything I've seen, it seems to have been part of Wheeler's nature that he just was, he was meticulous like that. He was an archivist, he was a chronicler, he was a, and to a certain extent, it must have been galling, one would think, for him to write to Kipling for a reference. Especially when clearly there were people saying to him that, don't, it won't go down well. But the fact that he was applying for the role of librarian, I believe, of the Oriental Club, and it was clearly a position that he was very well suited for. And not only that, it was a position that Kipling well understood that Wheeler was very well suited for, and was he wrote, I'd swear an affidavit to it that your that your memory and your organizational skills marked you out for this job. But again, that was something else that struck me, that it can't have been easy for Wheeler to write to Kipling asking for for a job reference. Especially someone who was like 10 years his junior, who'd previously been his employee.
Absolutely, yeah. Oh, Carrie, did you have your hand raised? Would you like to ask a question?
Hi. Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. So, I was so fascinated by your comment that he was a collector of stories. And I was wondering, so what is your sense of where the stories come from? Do you think he collected from the newses he edited, or from Anglo-Indians, or did he kind of do the field work or talking to? Does he kind of give a sense of the, for example, native informants? And actually, did he speak any other languages than English?
Well, I mean, apart from, I'm aware that of his expertise in classical languages, and that there's a reference in one of his books to him having some knowledge of Persian, but I don't know in detail about languages, but certainly looking through, that's the book there, isn't it? The book he wrote about the Amir Abdurrahman, which again is the one that's most full of individual stories. In almost every case, he gives the name of the source. He gives the name of the person who he got the story from. He almost never sort of just tells a story and says, he gives the sources for stories, which perhaps is another comment about his meticulous nature. Some of those stories, there was a number of those stories which I found mirrored in his father's work, especially James Talboys Wheeler wrote, I think it's, I've forgotten the exact title, but it's Strange and Narratives of Old India, or Rare and Curious Narratives of Old India. And there's a number of stories that appear in that that Stephen Wheeler mentions again. He got a number of stories from James, I'm not sure how do you pronounce it, Alex Darmstadt? He gives a number of stories that and he gives Darmstadt as the source, but in almost and a number of his stories, and interestingly, a number of his stories he gives the Amir himself as the source, which, and I don't know whether Wheeler met him or if so when, but there's a number of stories, particularly some of the fables. The interesting one about the duck in the pond with the wolves one side and the tiger the other, that he recites, that he gives the Amir himself as his source. So whether it's just that he had a talent for remembering stories and the people he got them from, Kipling referred to his cast steel memory and his store of Oriental knowledge, but Wheeler seems to have had a talent for not only for remembering stories, but remembering who he got the story from, and being scrupulously accurate with his stories, even at the cost of losing maybe some of the sensational aspect of it. With the story of the guy that the Amir sends up the tower without any food to wait for the Russians, he doesn't give the outcome. He doesn't say what happens, because he wasn't told what happened. Now, it makes the story less interesting, and Kipling clearly makes the story a lot more interesting, but Kipling is fabricating and imagining the story, isn't he? So it's Wheeler he seemed to have had an excellent memory for remembering not only what he was told, but who told it to him. But there's no evidence that he ever wanted to embellish or improve stories to make them better, which again must be something quite a hard thing to resist at times.
Does he comment on the stories?
Occasionally, but even then, I think he seems to keep his comments. He keeps his political opinions very much to himself. He draws sort of moral conclusions at times from fables. The fable for Afghanistan, where he tells the story of how the Amir related the story of Afghanistan being a duck in a pond with the wolves one side and the tiger the other. He draws sort of the moral allegory of clearly Britain being the tiger and Russia being the wolves, and but he doesn't really comment in depth on these. Again, he seems to see his role in his writing very much as a chronicler rather than a commentator. That he's an archivist of facts, that he's a chronicler of stories and events, but not really someone who draws conclusions from them. And perhaps that's why, to some extent, perhaps that's why he isn't better known, because some of the stories and some of the episodes he relates could be so much more entertaining if he had been willing to perhaps comment on them a little more or embellish them a little, but that clearly wasn't in his nature.
Well, I was also going to ask about this, because this is a major undertaking. It's a major work for him, this book, the Amir Abdul Rahman. And does the preface offer also the fact that it features a frontispiece photographic portrait of the Emir himself suggests some sort of official connection with the king? So does the foreword offer any clue as to whether this was a commission? Was it sanctioned, authorized by the subject?
It was published for the Amir's visit to London in 18. It was published literally 2 or 3 weeks before the Amir arrived in London for an official visit in 1895. And clearly that wasn't coincidental. So whether that was commissioned, I mean, I don't have a lot of information about this publishing house. The original publishing house were, I believe it was, it's a series of books called Public Men of Today, an international series. And the original publishing house was it Bliss? I've got it written down. So Bliss, Sands and Sands and Foster of Craven Street, Strand, were the original publishing house. I don't know a lot about Bliss, Sands and Foster, who they were.
Not a major firm, no.
But it's part of a series of Public Men of Today. And if you look at the list of the other people that forthcoming volumes, Cecil Rhodes, the German Emperor William II, Pope Leo XIII.
That's interesting, yeah.
So it was clearly a series of books about figures who were in the public eye at the time.
From all over the world,
yeah,
including a Chinese official.
Yes, but even when he has humorous anecdotes, and there are humorous anecdotes in it, they're humorous not because Wheeler's taken a story and made it humorous. They're humorous just because he's been told a funny story and he's related the story exactly as it's been told, which again, to a certain extent, maybe the book raises as many questions as it answers, because there's a lot of evidence, I think, in his works that perhaps he wasn't as humorless as suggested, but at the same time, he doesn't come across as imaginative. He doesn't come across particularly as creative. He comes across very much as someone who is chronicling and relating stories that he's been told. Everything is documented. Everything is referenced. Every single story he lists, he gives the name of the person he got it from. And one wonders how many stories he left out, perhaps because he couldn't reference them, or perhaps because he wasn't sure of their provenance. You know, perhaps what's not in there, of course, one doesn't know. But almost every story in that book its provenance is given, who he got the story from, who told it to him, and occasionally, you know, he'll give a story and he'll say such and such a person told, relates this story, you know, which cannot be verified or something along those lines. So if he's not 100% sure about provenance, he says so. But it's you know, in every case, for example, this one comes from General Roberts in 1879. I mean, he was clearly well connected and knew, like Sir Lepel Griffin said, gives the story. So, you know, he was clearly well connected, and he refers at one point to the fact that he hasn't included gossip from the bazaars of Lahore. And it was a part of me that wondered for a second whether that was a very, very sly dig at Kipling. But Wheeler clearly was not someone who dealt in gossip from the bazaars of Lahore. Doesn't mean that he necessarily didn't have an interest in it, but he didn't write it unless it was gossip that he verified, double checked, and got from someone who he could be sure it was a little more than gossip.
That is how Kipling would phrase a commentary on the Emir, and he would show the ordinary people gossiping about the Emir and his policy. That might even be in Kim, isn't it? They talk about the Emir when Mehboob Ali appears in the caravanserai near the start. My memory fails me.
Yeah. But there's so much in some of those articles about Afghanistan where Wheeler very clearly had such an interest in, you know, the imminent, and a belief in the imminence of the Russian threat, that you know, the fact that he chose to offload or to share some of that particular work on that topic with Kipling very early on, can that perhaps be seen as a sign of trust, even as a wish to share, you know, the topic that interested him most with someone he got to spend a lot of time with. So, they, you know, something that presumably he wanted to discuss. Whereas I think the tendency has been to see that when Kipling complains about having to translate articles from boring Russian newspapers, to see that as perhaps, you know, something that Wheeler sort of dumped on Kipling because it was the boring grunt work that he didn't want to do, whereas it was very much Wheeler's particular field. That was Wheeler's that was Wheeler's baby, that topic.
Of course, we're going, yeah. Well, I'm going vicariously by thinking this is boring task work, but no, this is a very young Kipling talking with a knowledgeable man about the great game, basically. Yeah, shaping his ideas of what will be the subject of his future writing.
There's I think, I can't remember the exact date, but in 1884 there's a whole like full page article on page 2 of the CMG entitled "The Great Game," where, and it's a full page where presumably Wheeler, because Kipling wrote that he was responsible for every part of the paper except the first 2 pages. And this is on page 2, so I'm presuming Wheeler wrote it. And it's this very, very long sort of call to arms about how we need to defend ourselves against this Russian threat. And the title of the article is "The Great Game." This is a full page article. And I'm presuming again that Wheeler wrote that article.
But Kipling must have won his confidence fairly early. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think so. I mean, possibly not as an organizer, You know, on a personal level, I get that feeling. You know, at the same time, one feels that Wheeler was probably aware that Kipling was not as meticulous
Yeah.
and as naturally organized as perhaps Wheeler wanted him to be, or perhaps as he needed to be, to
Whereas Wheeler was.
as Wheeler, no, and Kipling was clearly never going to be organized in the same way that Wheeler was. His talents clearly lay in a very different.
Yeah.
But to a certain extent, Wheeler had no choice. I mean, his health was not great. He was frequently off, you know, off work, and you know, when he had an accident or when he was ill, you know, there was nobody else he had to.
No, right.
To leave to manage the newspaper except Kipling. So,
but he could have gone back to the proprietors if he didn't have confidence in Kipling, couldn't he?
Indeed, but that also suggests that presumably he saw something, because he interviewed Kipling back in England, and he telegraphed, you know, the proprietors to say Kipling will do.
Right.
I mean, he could have, you know, he could have said no, thank you very much.
Right.
So presumably, you know, given the fact that you know, Wheeler's family was at least as well connected, probably more well connected than Kipling's, one presumes he was under no particular obligation to accept Kipling as his assistant if he hadn't wanted him. You know, he was just about to be promoted to an editorship that he'd worked 7 years for. I would presume the last thing he would have wanted was to saddle himself with someone who he'd met and got the impression was going to be useless.
Right.
And by that time, he'd been working in India for 7 years. He was clearly friends with Percy Sinnett, the editor. He was well connected in Anglo-India. He was well respected in Anglo-India. He could have interviewed Kipling and sent a message saying, "Find me somebody else, please. I don't."
Right.
So one presumes that Kipling made some sort of positive impression, or Wheeler saw something from him in that interview that suggested to him that Kipling was at least malleable into I don't want to say a sound second-rate journalist, because I think that was you know, and I do think that there's an element to which some of this impression of Wheeler did originate with Kay Robinson, because you know, Kipling's reaction to working with Kay Robinson was so different because of, you know, of the fact that, you know, these floodgates were suddenly opened.
But he'd learned his trade by then, hadn't he?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think, and you know, had Kay Robinson replaced Stephen Wheeler a couple of years earlier, you wonder what the outcome would have been. But it's just, you know, the 4 years that he spent with Wheeler, you know, he had been, you know, he hadn't been turned into Wheeler, because he was never going to be turned into someone with that level of meticulous punctiliousness. But he had at least learnt enough to be able to, you know, to manage the paper effectively and do an editor's job effectively. You know, by the time Kay Robinson replaced Wheeler and if you like, completely changed the ambiance and direction of the paper and its editorship.
But I mean, I think we've all picked up the negative comments of Kipling on Wheeler, which have obviously influenced the biographers and have been picked up by them. And I think the splendid thing about what you've offered us this evening is that is a sort of major corrective. It's the other side of the story, which suddenly becomes very credible. And in fact, then when you go back and look at what Kipling has written, you realize that one perhaps has put the wrong construction on it.
Yeah, and I think there's an extent, you know, I mean, I hesitate to put it this way because it sounds like I'm comparing myself. But you know, if I look back to my first job when I was 16 and working in a supermarket, stuck with shelves, and the boss I was working for, who I detested at the time, was basically trying to explain to me how you had to organize all the stuff. So the stuff with the newest dates was at the front, and you had to put the new stock at the back. And all I really wanted to do was chat up the girl working behind the cheese counter.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and so I'd go home and I'd slag this guy off to my friends. And looking back, all he was trying to do was show me how to do the job. And I was making a hash of it and complaining as only a teenage boy can complain when you're not allowed to do what you want to do. And I think there's an element of what I think when one goes back and reads through those letters of Kipling's in 1882 and 1883, one's got to remember he was 16, 17.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, this was his first job. This was his first boss. And some of the time he just didn't appreciate being told this is what you've got to do. You know, the job isn't always glamorous. It isn't always fun. It requires, you know, what he wanted to do was write poetry and write stories. Clearly his boss didn't really want him doing that in his office time.
In his office time, on the paper, exactly. Yeah, right.
That's good. Yeah, you must appreciate. Carrie.
Yeah, is this part of your PhD? Right.
It's not the direct focus of my PhD. I mean, my PhD thesis or study is basically on Kipling's earliest Indian verse and on departmental ditties and on basically how Kipling, if you like, adapted that existing genre of Anglo-Indian verse and utilized the messages of it. And I sort of got into Wheeler as a bit of a tangent because he interested me. But I do think that it's not something I'm going to miss out completely.
I also would like to read Kipling through Wheeler would be fascinating. Like the articles which you haven't looked at, it's about Sikh and War. Like article about that one must be very good one to read the Sahib's War, for example.
Yeah, I haven't. Some of those articles on the bibliography. Some of them I have found. Most of them I've dug out and read. But the one on Sikhs and Boers, I still haven't found and read. Sikhs and Boers are parallel.
Yeah, that one is a very great one to read the Kipling's Boer War stories. But,
yeah, and it's interesting that one was also written during the Boer War in 1900 when Kipling was, I believe, was out in South Africa as a journalist, wasn't he?
Such a curious. I mean, it could be some sort of boring martial race theory, or it could actually be some sort of synthetic portrait of the Boers.
Yeah,
much maligned at the time. And Sikhs being such a loyalist component to the British Army.
Anglo-Saxon magazine. I don't know if that's on the Hathi Trust somewhere. So I mean, the title suggests it's some sort of long dead colonial imperial magazine, but I'm not familiar with the magazine. I don't think I've ever come across it.
Yeah, there could be a synthetic portrait of the Boers as religious dissidents who sought out their own country. That's the only parallel I can imagine, apart from the martial race theory. That would definitely put him at odds with Kipling if he was making any defense of the Boers in 1900.
Yeah, which is another reason why it'd be interesting to dig that one out and read it. Yeah.
Are there any final questions for Rufus before we close out? Thank you all for joining tonight, and thank you all, of course, to Rufus for such a stimulating discussion. Paper following to a very stimulating discussion, which has led us late into the evening. As Rufus just explained, his PhD thesis is on the departmental ditties, and we will definitely be hearing from him in future, I expect, in these fora in the journal, either in his capacity as the author of this important new study of the ditties, or as a biographer in waiting of the forgotten man of letters, Stephen Wheeler.
Thanks to Alex, and thank you to everybody for your questions and for your input. Much appreciated. And it's been a pleasure to get the opportunity to speak in this august forum.
Join us again in April, where we'll be hearing from Professor Harish Trivedi, who'll be joining us from Delhi, speaking on Kipling, the Rajas and the Raj, the Kipling and the princely states. And for now, I can do no better than ask you all to close with a hearty round of applause to Rufus Vaughan-Spruce.
Students at school don't do that.
No paper airplanes here.
So